Greetings, everyone. Hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. Yesterday, Swen did a podcast interview where he directly addressed a recent controversy that arose regarding whether or not Baldur's Gate 3 has raised the bar for RPGs and if it's fair for other developers to be held to that same standard. I know many of you probably don't pay attention to Twitter controversies, so let me provide a brief recap. Nelson Jr. is a developer and also runs the game studio Strange Scaffold. I have never played any of his games, but by all accounts it seems that he is well respected by other developers. He put out a string of tweets conveying that while he is excited for Baldur's Gate 3, he also wants to push back against players using that game to set a raised standard for RPGs going forward. Before I go any further, let me make it clear, this is not a channel where we spread hate, harass folks, or demonize them for merely opening a dialogue. You are free to disagree with them, but keep your comments civil unless you want to be banned. Alright, back to his tweets. Nelson said the reason why this is concerning is because the vast majority of developers don't have Larian's resources, and they don't have the special situation that allowed Larian to be successful in developing Baldur's Gate 3. These advantages included the long dev cycle, 2 successful previous games, early access providing feedback and cash flow, a huge team across several offices, etc., etc. Basically, his point was this isn't a new benchmark, it's an anomaly and should be treated as such. He also noted that making games of this size and scope could end up destroying Larian, which is all the more reason why developers should not be held to that standard. These tweets absolutely exploded online, to the point that massive streamers like Wolfheart FPS and Asmongold covered the topic. Asmongold's videos at almost 1 million views, and Wolfheart's isn't doing shabby either, so yeah, this spread like wildfire. Nelson followed up with a series of videos further explaining his points and also directly responding to people who said his comments reeked of a developer who is afraid of reaching a new standard.
I'm a game developer, and I've been talking a lot recently about how the size of your game determines what you can and can't make. And as a result, a lot of people have been coming into my mentions and saying, this guy sounds scared. This guy sounds like he isn't ready to reach the raised bar that we're getting because of the mega games that exist right now. And I'm not scared. I'm very good at my job. And there are few things in this world that I love as much as not just fulfilling player expectations, but exceeding them, making experiences especially that seem ridiculous or like they shouldn't work into games that are meaningful and that reach players in ways that otherwise would never be possible. There's one thing that scares me though, and it's that players aren't being told what they're losing. Every mega game intended to reach the entire world at a single time. There are 100 video games you're not being allowed to play that would have specifically been just for you.
Interesting stuff, right? Multiple people asked me to react to the tweets, and I chose not to because I realized my perspective would probably be somewhat divisive, and I wasn't in the mood to argue that week. I've got time today, so there are chapters below if you want to skip around. My first reaction to the tweets was that it puts me in a weird spot, because apparently I am the last person on the planet who believes there's a possibility Baldur's Gate 3 is actually not a good game. We have access to maybe 30 hours of a game that is supposed to be several times that size. And a game as huge as what Larian has reported, with so many different permutations, it's completely within the realm of possibility that the content which players have never touched is badly broken. A lot of the people who seem to believe that's not possible never played Divinity Original Sin 2. If it turns out Baldur's Gate 3 has an incredible first act, a mediocre final act that is worse than the acts preceding it, the ending is terrible, and the experience has a myriad of technical issues, that would be completely consistent with Larian's last game. This would be a concern even if the game was releasing in its planned time frame. It's especially true in this situation when they moved the release date up a month on the fly. There's no way that didn't have an impact on development. To hammer this point home even further, watch the beginning of the podcast interview. They asked Finn how are things going, and he says Larian is dealing with an emergency. He sounds absolutely terrified. Larian allowed content creators to apply for review codes on Friday, so presumably they were sent out this weekend. He looks like a man who really isn't sure if his code is going to hold up under scrutiny. Let me be absolutely clear. I love this. He's afraid because he's trying to do something great, something that really hasn't been done before. That is to be applauded, and it's one of the reasons I am so excited to play Baldur's Gate 3. But just because you try to do something great doesn't mean you actually succeed. We don't know yet if Icarus has touched the sun, so all this talk about raised standards rings hollow to me. Let's put that point to the side, though, and say everybody's right and Larian has struck gold once again. In that case, I both agree and disagree with Nelson's comments. I agree that it's important for indie developers to feel comfortable being themselves, as opposed to living under the shadow of what studios with far larger budgets are able to accomplish. His point about valuing studios who make the exact type of game you are looking for, even if it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of other great games, rings home for me. I love games like Black Geyser, Tyranny, and Pathfinder Kingmaker, even though they are comparatively janky experiences, because it's the exact type of game I love to play, and that makes me appreciate the studios that made them. The problem is, I just don't think this is a concern with Baldur's Gate 3, most especially because Baldur's Gate has always been a series that appeals to CRPG enthusiasts. People who prefer CRPGs are naturally trained to value small developers because, for the most part, large, well-funded developers don't respect our lane enough to make games focused on us. That's part of the reason we are getting Avowed instead of Pillars of Eternity 3. That's also part of the reason why what Larian is doing is so incredible. So when Nelson says you have to recognize the special situation Larian has put itself in and not expect other studios to produce the same results, it kind of feels like he's preaching to the choir. Sure, he's right, but we're not really the ones who need to hear it. All right, now let's circle back to Sven and his podcast interview. The podcast is called Friends Per Second, and it's on the Skill Up YouTube channel. Usually the podcast is hosted by Ralph, who is a very popular reviewer of video games and walks through gaming-related news on a weekly basis. If you have never checked out the Skill Up channel before, I highly recommend it. For the recent podcast episode, Ralph was away, so the interview was hosted by Lucy James, who is a senior producer at GameSpot and a creative producer at Giant Bomb, along with Jake Baldino, who reviews video games for Gameranx and his personal YouTube channel that is the same as his name. I will leave a link to his YouTube channel and the podcast episode in the description below. During the podcast, Lucy James brings up the controversy and asks for Sven's thoughts on the subject. He starts out making it clear that Larian is just trying to make their game. They are not focused on raising any bars. Then he also makes a fantastic point that similar discussions popped up when Assassin's Creed first came out, and yet the RPG landscape didn't really change, and there are still plenty of different games in the genre coming out.
I mean, when I started out, Ubisoft launched Assassin's Creed, and everybody was saying everything's going to be like Assassin's Creed. You're all doomed. Nobody's going to be able to make this game anymore. Here we are, many years later. Plenty of games exist. Assassin's Creed still exists. I mean, there were games like Assassin's Creed, but there's plenty of other things. So if you want to make something exactly like us, yeah, you're going to need a large team, but you don't have to make something exactly like us. There's so much stuff that you can do.
I am old enough to remember those discussions, and he's absolutely right. People made a big deal about all the waves Assassin's Creed was supposedly going to make, and in the end, nothing really changed. That doesn't make those games any less awesome, and in fact, it's a good thing, because it means developers are still free to make the exact type of game they want to. Sven then makes another fascinating point that standards are constantly changing, and the level of expectations is more so in the hands of platforms than it is in the hands of developers.
When it comes to standards, standards change continuously. So it's not as if there's something that is a standard. So I don't think that is things people should be worried about, to be honest. When it comes to resources, I mean, well, if you talk about the likes of Microsoft or, well, Activision Blizzard is Microsoft now, and they are large companies. They have resources. They can do whatever they want. From a player point of view, I would come to expect that the platform holders at least set the standards, because that's how it usually has been in the past. They always say, hey, here's the guiding light. People, this is possible now, so go and do stuff with it. I mean, that's always been how I looked at platforms. So coming from there, that would be a bit of a strange statement, but in general, games like ours are something very specific. This is what we wanted to make. It's what we specialize in. So it's logical that we have a certain pedigree in creating it, because we've been building this for 20 years already, right? So, but there's so much stuff out there that is different, and so I saw the discourse obviously, but I didn't really understand why it was a discourse.
Right.
I don't think there's such a thing as a game that says, "Oh, this is the standard," and everybody has to hold itself to it, because tomorrow somebody else will come up with something new and cool, and that'll be now the new standard. And these standards change so rapidly that there's no standard.
I never thought about the standards that way, but Sven is absolutely right. It's really Sony and Microsoft who guide the culture along and decide what the standard of each generation actually is. Even those of us who mainly play on the PC cannot really escape their authority. This is part of what makes the situation regarding the Series S so frustrating. That's covered in this podcast, but we'll talk about it in a separate video. Sven also reiterates my stance that people haven't even seen the game, and therefore there's no way for them to know if it sets a standard. He also walks through a list of other RPGs that he believes set new standards, while again circling back to standards don't really exist when it comes to video games.
But there's a lot of other stuff that we want to play. So, I mean, everybody played Disco Elysium, right? So that was made by a much smaller team than our team, and it was a great and fantastic game. So that's a standard now. I'm a big fan of Into the Breach. That's a standard for me. So, you got a whole bunch of standards out there. I mean, like my youngest son, the only game that exists in the universe is Minecraft. That's a standard for him. It's a big one. So, I find it a weird discourse, just the entire standard thing. I mean, like, especially now in a period, because I'm already been in this industry for quite some time. Back in the days, there you had a whole bunch of different games. Then suddenly it came a few types of games. And now with the advent of digital distribution, we have so many genres of games. So where's the standard in all these games? I mean, like, again, I understand that if you have to make a business case for it, you're going to say, oh, it's like this or it's like that. It's always been the case. But I don't buy into this idea, oh, this is now the standard. This is how it should be. That doesn't exist. Not in video games.
As always, Sven is fascinating to listen to, and I agree with his perspective. There is no real standard. Larian's example is one that developers can learn from, in the sense that if you hone your craft and try to be the very best at making your particular types of games, sometimes success will follow. Success is not guaranteed, and it's a long, hard road for everyone. That's why we expect more from AAA studios, while being much more forgiving towards small indie studios who are doing their best to add their own unique flavor to the industry. That's all I have for this particular subject. Again, I highly recommend you check out the podcast episode. Hope all of you enjoy this video. Take care.